Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We're just waiting for a few more people to come in out of the waiting room to join us tonight. Great to see so many people joining us tonight. Thank you. We're just waiting for a few more people to hop on. All right, Sarah. I don't see anyone else in the waiting room, so I guess we'll go ahead and get started, and we'll let people come in if they arrive a little bit late.
Sure. Sounds good.
Your sister's here.
I best behave.
Well, welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining us tonight to attend our museum talks, Countryside Chronicles Latimer Diaries with Sarah Cooper Godoy. Thank you, Sarah, for joining us tonight and sharing all the wonderful wealth of information that you have discovered. And thank you to the Latimer family for sharing this beautiful diary with us and the community. My name is Jillian Metcalfe. I'm the Executive Director with the Osgood Township Museum, located in Vernon, Ontario. And with me today is Caitlin McDougall, Education Officer with the Osgood Township Museum. And so we're going to be helping to moderate the discussion tonight with the Q&As at the end. For everyone who isn't familiar with Zoom, we have a chat function at the very bottom. So please feel free at any time to add any of your questions there, and then we will do our best to answer those at the end of Sarah's presentation. Before we get started, I'm just going to do a little quick poll to see how many people we have joining us tonight. So I'll go ahead and do that right now while we're waiting for some people to join us. So if you don't mind, there's a question that pops up on your screen. How many people, including yourself in the household, is participating in tonight? So I'll put that up there for a minute. We still got people joining in. For everyone that's just joining in, we have a poll up here just to get some numbers as to how many people are joining us tonight. Okay. And Sarah, next slide, please.
Oh.
Thank you. Before we get started with the presentation this evening, the museum wants to take this time to acknowledge that the museum located in Vernon, Ontario, just south in the city of Ottawa, is on the traditional and ceded ancestral land of the Algonquin Anishinaabe. Algonquin Anishinaabe are the original inhabitants of this territory along the Ottawa, Rideau, and Casta rivers, and have lived on this land since time immemorial. We are grateful to have the opportunity to present in this territory. And next slide, please. Thank you. So for those who aren't familiar with the museum, we're located in Burton, Ontario, just off Bank Street. We have a 3-acre site, and on that site, we have a main building, which is a former 2-room schoolhouse that houses our permanent exhibit space. We have an agricultural barn built in the late 1980s that features our agricultural collection, tractors, threshing mills, and other agricultural equipment. We have a beautiful heritage school garden that was developed in the early 2000s. And then a new project that we are working on right now is our sensory garden, which will be complete, fingers crossed, at the end of 2021. Next slide, please. So this is an image of our new permanent exhibit space that was developed in 2020. So if you have the opportunity, we would love to see you there and come and visit our space. Next slide, if you have one.
All right.
There we go, we're good.
All right. So can people still see me if I show the diary now?
I see some nodding heads.
Yes, perfect. Okay. Hi, thanks for logging in, everybody. Today I want to give you an overview of this super interesting new addition, new resource that the Osgoode Township Museum has had the opportunity to add to their collection, not the actual book, but the transcription. So I just wanted you to see, first of all, because when you're thinking of a diary, you might be thinking of something really tiny that you could just slip in your pocket or under your, under your bed so no one would find it. But this, in fact, is the size of the diary that I'm going to be talking to you tonight about. Okay, so have any of you kept a diary? I wonder if, a diary is a very personal thing, and it's something special to read, I think, more exciting than a history book, because we sort of imagine we're going to find something really personal or really, private, some insight into the person's life, more so than a history book. So now this book is very proper, so no scandals have been discovered, but it's really very interesting, and it's just really interesting piece of history. And often in the past, novelists would write, or even now, novelists will often write a book and tell you that it's a diary just because it attracts us. So that's one of the things that for me was really interesting about this diary. So what is this diary going to tell us about life in the 1900s? Very briefly, I just wanted to give you a little intro to who I am. Some of you may know me, but basically, I'm Sarah Cooper, and I have a background in English and ESL. I love words. I love to read. And my parents were immigrants also, like the ancestors of these people who wrote the diary. My parents came from England in the 50s. And how I got access to this diary was that the two sisters who own the diary offered to share it with me and my sister. And one of the reasons is because we all have lived in the house where this diary was written. So that was why I was particularly interested when I had the chance to read it. And I sort of thought to myself, this will be just a great little project, and I'll just type it up. That'll be it. So it turns out that it's actually was more work maybe than I thought, and also was a lot of really interesting information in the diary. So first of all, I want you to know what time frame this diary is written in. There's 2 sections, and but most of it, the part I'm going to talk to you about today, is in the early 1900s, which we would call historically the Edwardian age, which is because the King of England and Canada was a colony, maybe still is. So that mattered to Canada. It was in the Edwardian age, and also at the time of World War I, which was a huge event. And the second part of the diary is written just after World War II. So this sketch that you see here is the diary has not only words in it, but it has a lot of sketches written because there were multiple writers in the diary, and some of them were children. So we can see here in this picture some of the things that were important to the little boy who drew this. And this time when this boy wrote in the diary was a time of great transition. They were moving from horses to motorized vehicles. We can see he's drawn pictures of cars. There were telephones were becoming more available. I know we had telephones in the village of Metcalfe at that time. And World War I is just an amazingly huge historical event that affected Canadians and people in Europe, obviously. And in fact, the boy who drew this picture did go on later to enlist in the war, and in fact died quite young as a result, probably of damage to his body due to serving in the war. So that's very sad. So I'm going to concentrate mostly though on the earlier entries, so not in the 40s and 50s part. It's also important to know for people that might not live right in our area where the diary was written, because it's a very local diary, so it makes a difference to know where it is. So this diary was written in what was called then Osgood Township, and our museum is even still called the Osgood Township Museum. This is a map just a little bit earlier than the time of the diary, but it still was the municipal boundaries were still relevant, and where the green arrow shows you the township where the diary family was written, lived, and where the diary was written. You can see at the top of the picture, there's the Ottawa River, okay? And you can see the dark red there, it would be the city of Ottawa at that time. And our township, Osgood Township, has now in fact been amalgamated, for those who aren't local, has now been amalgamated right into the city of Ottawa. But in those days, it was quite a far away place, an exciting, useful place to get to, was Ottawa. In the early days, of course, this land belonged to, was lived on by the Anishinaabe peoples. And in the late 1700s and early 1800s, the land was declared empty politically and was then surveyed into sections. So on this map, it's very handy, we can see the land divided into rectangles. So those rectangles would have been 100 or 200 acres. So all of the province was just chopped up into squares, except where there was a river maybe. So that was how land was those pieces of land were then given out later or sold. So we're going to see, now this is a close-up of that map, and these maps that I'm showing you are available free online, and it's a great resource if you're interested in local history at all, because you can look up more or less where your house might be or your subdivision, and you can see the name of the owners in 1879, which is kind of an interesting thing to see. And in our community, because some families have lived here a very long time, there are still pieces of land that are lived on by the same family that lived there in 1879, which is quite interesting as well. And these maps showed in 1879 the name of the landowner, and also the little black dots, which you may be able to see depending on the size of your screen, show the houses. So again, historically, we can see what houses were on the land in 1879. And so this predates the diary, but we can see the house, which I'm going to show you, is the same house. So that house was there in 1879, or a house was in that location. Also on this map in our township, we can see the Castor River, which you may or may not know is the river, the rivers, the branches that run through our township and run into the South Nation River, and then into the Ottawa River and down to the St. Lawrence. These rivers would have been very important in the 1800s and even in the early 1900s when the family were writing this diary, because water was used for power and it was used for transportation. Also, if you live in this area, you will know that if you live between branches of rivers, it's likely that your land is quite soggy. That is a nice way to say swampy. So our township has some excellent agricultural land, but we all probably know somebody who has a farm that grows great rocks, which unfortunately for this family, their land was quite rocky, which wasn't as bad perhaps in the early days, but for large machinery nowadays, you can't farm on very, very rocky land. So where exactly was this diary written? Well, we're very fortunate to have this picture, which is a little bit in the middle of when the years that the diary was written, of a picture of the house, the actual house where this diary was written. This is the Latimer house. And when I grew up there in the 60s rather, it was still called the Latimer house. Because that family had owned that land and worked that land for over 100 years. This house was built in the 1870s. You can see that it's a limestone house, which is a little bit more unusual in our area. In Kingston area, you see a lot of stone houses, but in our township, there are not very many stone houses. This would have been a very good house to live in. A step up, let's say, from a log cabin, which is probably how this family may have started in early days when they first moved to the land. This is the land, and the rocks, in fact, are covered with fossils, right? The limestone rocks are full of fossils from the Great Champlain Sea that used to sit on this land. So that's kind of an interesting reminder of how recent humans are in this part of the world. You can see this house has a porch that's very typical of houses in those days, and it has shutters. And in the diary, our main writer of the diary, who you're going to meet very soon, she mentions this chore that she would have to take those shutters down and put those shutters up again. And a lot of people still have maybe the old shutters sitting in their barn, but no longer put them on because they have modern windows now. So, and this house also at the back had a summer kitchen and also had multiple sheds and barns as well, which was typical of the time. So what does that diary look like inside? I told you I transcribed it. So what did that look like? Some of the writing was pretty clear because, people wrote with what they call copper plate. People were taught to write their letters in the very same way so that everybody's script would be the same and it would be easy to read. We do see, so the top piece is written by a little boy, and his writing is pretty easy for me to read. On the bottom right, the script got a little more complicated. And on the left, you can see that Millie, the main writer, for some reason in later years, decided to write sideways across. So not really sure why, but it certainly made for interesting transcription. This book that I showed you that's so large that they wrote in was actually a wedding register. So at the top of the page, which you can see here at the top, there are columns and categories to write the bride and the bride's groom and the place of birth and all those details to register weddings. It wasn't really designed as a diary, but it obviously was useful, and the family must have come across it and decided to use that. So it's another challenge with transcribing the diary was trying to figure out who was writing which section. So the museum kindly took photographs, and you might want to do this if you ever work on a diary that's old. You don't want to be flipping those pages back and forth all the time. And also with the photographs, I could then zoom in and try to read better what the text was saying. Now, this is the challenge of why when I said I don't know who always was writing the diary. There are at least five people over the years wrote in this diary that we know for sure. So the first person that we know and who did most of the writing was Millie. And Millie was a single woman. At the time of the diary, she was in her late 30s, early 40s, and she was living with her brother Fred and her sister-in-law Fanny in that old farmhouse. Well, it wasn't so old for her, in that stone farmhouse. And Fred and Fanny have 3 boys, Henry, Forrest, and Benson. Forrest was the oldest, then Harry, and then Benson. And so those 3 boys and her brother and sister-in-law were her, who she lived with all the time. And her sister, Millie's sister, we read in the diary, also comes to visit and stay overnight quite often. She is another single sister, and she lives in Metcalfe and works in a hat making store. So she comes back and forth as well. But those people, Millie and her nephews, are the ones who in the first generation wrote that diary. And then there was a gap where we can only assume that, interest fell off. People weren't writing in the diary. And then Harry's children, Helen, Ruth, Hugh, and Marina, all took turns writing a few things into the diary. So this is a really fun piece of work to work with, because it's got all these different people. Millie and Fred actually have 12, I think there are 12 children in their family, which was common in those days. And many of those people married and stayed within the community. So Millie has a lot of family support, a lot of people to visit, and a lot of people that she writes about in her diary. So this is also fun. And she writes about many of the people that she visits or who are involved in the farming with her brother Fred. So who are mentioned in the diary? Well, I just said, a lot of people. I actually did a little tally. There's about over 195 different names of people in the diary. Many are the Latimer family or relatives. Many are not. Some people I was able to work out who they were. Sometimes I could not figure out who they were. Sometimes Millie misspells names, or let's say is creative in her spelling. So I'm not exactly sure. So you may see a name on this slide that looks like your family name, and it may well be, even though if it's spelled slightly differently, because people were quite flexible with their spelling in those days. Often very phonetic spelling was used. The other thing that is interesting, the confounding factor in the diary, is that often Millie would use a short form. So she would write, F went to town. So we already know that there's Fanny, Fred, Forrest, and her sister is also called Fanny, or sometimes Frankie. So you really have to do some calculations and get into the story to figure out which person was it, who was most likely to be going to town late at night. And actually in the diary, as a transcriber, you can't change what you write, what you see. So, but I made some educated guesses, and when you read it, you will be able to as well. And the museum will be selling copies of this diary, and in the back, there is an index of all the people so that you can look and see, here's my family, let's say the Hurley family. And if I could figure out who they were, I give there's just a little short note so you can see how that person might be related to Millie, if in fact they were a relative, or if they were a farming associate or something like that. So now you can see I love maps. Where did most of these people live, many of the people who Millie mentions? How big is her world? So here we see some of the families that are most mentioned in the diary. Thank you to the museum for making this visual. And looking at this diary, at this map, I could make some educated guesses about where the family is, home was. The names in the green might not sync with the name that you see on the map, because remember, I mentioned that this map is actually from 1879. So it's possible that the property may have changed hands in the time since then. To understand the distance that we might be talking about, because Millie often mentions she's just popping down to Metcalfe, or Fred is often going to Metcalfe, we can see the Latimer farm and we can see the village of Metcalfe there. That's about 5 kilometers. Okay, so that's an easy bicycle ride if you owned one, or certainly a quick trot in your buggy, or a walk. Most people walked. So what does this diary tell us about Metcalfe? You may not have a family member in this diary, and that's fine, because there's actually a lot of interesting things that you can learn about your community, or this community, just by looking at the diary. First of all, it's very Canadian, I feel. The weather. Almost every entry is prefaced or has a little comment about what the weather is like. Weather affects all aspects of this family's life and everybody's life in the community, as it still does for us, really. Millie tells us if the night is clear, if there's an eclipse. There are sketches. The boys put sketches, you can see here, of constellations, because the stars, imagine how the sky would have been so open and beautiful in those days, as it still can be in Metcalfe, in the countryside. So we need to keep that in mind. That they needed the weather to be dry for traveling and planting. They needed to be wet for growing. The kids wanted icy for hockey. Hockey is very important to the boys. They needed snowy if they're going to snowshoe, and they needed to be the right temperature, that freeze temperature, for making maple syrup, which was a big business for them. So basically, weather is important. And here we can see a little, the diary also has more than words, has this little chart. So here's a chart that someone started, I don't know which of them, just measuring what the temperature was. But obviously the enthusiasm wore out after about a week, because it was clearly February and it was cold. So what about Millie? What was her day like? Well, not surprisingly, women worked very hard. And as a woman on the farm, she had a lot of tasks and just everyday things to do. And she always writes what she's up to. So we can see she's cleaning, she's canning, gardening, making maple syrup. Often she's watching the children, although she doesn't mention that as a specific task, but we know she is, because Fanny and Fred have gone out and she's at home with the boys. Maple syrup was a big business in the spring, which everybody helped with. And even the little boys would go out to help with that. And I grew up knowing where that maple sugar shack was on the farm. And it's a little bit of a hike from the house. And they would go back and forth all the time, to help with make the syrup. And as I mentioned, Millie's sister, we learn about what her jobs are. And she works in the hat store. And Millie's very pleased about this. She writes that she mentions that the hat store is opening, and that she's starting her job. And also her sister, Frankie, also was paid, got an honorarium for playing the organ in the church. So single women could have a job, even in a small community, and make some money. Working together, men and women, and not just husband and wife, but we see whole families worked really hard together to try to make a living. So here's the picture of the sugar shack, thanks to the Latimer family for sharing this picture. And I just really caught my eye, the amount of wood that's just stacked up, because we all know it takes a lot of wood to sugar off because you're boiling 24 hours a day, possibly for weeks on end. So you're just using up a lot of wood, and it would have been scrappy wood probably. These other photographs here are great ones from the collection in the museum. If you love old photos, it's great to go down and just pull out the folders and look at some of these. You can learn a lot from the photos. And these tasks were mentioned in the diary as well. Millie mentions about the threshing, the harvesting. And here we see this machine, which looks very dangerous to me, a small child posing beside this belt that's open. But the threshing machine would not have been owned by, not each farmer would have had their own thresher. That machine moved from farm to farm. And in the diary, we can, she will mention, you know, that they were working at someone's farm, and then the next day or the next few days, they're going to move it to another farm. So it seems to me that people helped each other. I don't know if they were paid, but we see here there's a lot of people in the photos. So perhaps they just helped each other as you know, as a group effort for everyone to get their harvest in. The photo, I hope you can see it on the top right, is a great photo, which was the classic style, and in the atlases that I mentioned from 1879, the county atlases, there are quite a few pictures or sketches like this, where a farmer would pay to have this photo or sketch done, and it's basically all his assets. He's got his farm equipment out, his people's family, laborers, all his livestock, everything is there in the picture, and his barn in the background. And I think that I wrote here, yes, that I believe that this is the Loney farm, which is another family which was directly connected to the Latimers. And interestingly, they also had a stone house, which was unusual, but obviously a thing. Now, in addition to farming in the summer, in the winter, these people were not going to Florida, and the off season, they were often working in lumbering. And what we can understand from the diary and from these photographs, which amazingly match up with the entries in the diary, we see that there were still in our township some really, really large trees. However, all this area would have been clear cut. And we know that wood was being used for everything, for, you know, for the thresher, for heating your house, for building your house. So there was a huge demand for lumber, not to mention selling it, you know, to other townships or other people beyond the borders of the township. So this picture on the left is so great for a find, because in fact it is Fred Latimer, Millie's brother, in the picture on the ground. And Fred, another Fred, see, I told you it was confusing, Fred Ecketts, who's, I believe, is a hired hand, or he appears in the diary multiple times working on the farm. And in the diary, they actually reference the exact time frame that this photo is dated to in 1908. So this was a very, very large tree, we can see. And obviously someone thought it was big enough, in fact, to take a photograph of it. So we can see Fred there, and the horses, they were obviously using horses in those days. And on the right is a picture of a mill. So we can see, and the men just posing there. There were several sawmills in the township. And so having cut your tree down, you then have to work out how you're going to get that tree to the mill. So that was quite a challenge. Let me see here. Oh, and also this interesting photograph had a reference. So we can figure out that actually Fred was now on his wife's, his in-laws' property, because the photograph references exactly the lot and the concession. And using that old map that I was telling you, we can look back and we can see that, oh yeah, that makes sense. He was down cutting trees on his in-laws' property. for them. So Forrest, the young boy who's in his teens, he gets to go along, and there's actually a nice little reference he wrote there. I went to the bush today with the men. I had a good time. Men from Vernon are drawing the logs today. They have 3 teams and are waltzing them away pretty fast, I can tell you. We cut down 5 trees today and sawed them into logs, and we ate our dinner in camp today. So this was obviously still quite an adventure for Forrest, perhaps not so much for the older men, but. Now, I'm digressing slightly, but this is a really interesting little book you can order from Lee Valley. Don't know if I'm allowed to, plug this. This is a book that Fred might have had, or the mill keeper might have had in their pocket. It is a very small little book with many useful charts, which a mill owner or a farmer would want to know. It allows you to calculate how much wood you can get out of a log of a certain size. So you would know how much wood you could expect back when you picked up your planks or whatever you'd asked it to be cut into. The other thing that's really interesting is that it gives a lot of information about how to care for your horses, because they were your machines. And it also tells you how much food you might need for your lumbering camp. So for example, you need apparently 1.8 pounds of flour per day per man in your lumber camp. This is important to know. You want to keep your your team of people well fed. The book also tells you exactly how to stack wood, which those of us who have ever had a fireplace, that stacking small pieces of wood there's quite an art to it. And in the diary, Forrest and Harry get a job, they mention, stacking wood, and they're quite happy. They're being paid for that. But then there's the sad little entry that they've stacked, various cords, and then it all sadly fell over. So clearly they perhaps didn't have a copy of this little book, or were trying to do it in a rush. And this is also interesting. The little piece I put on the right-hand side was how thick the ice needs to be to bear men on horses, to bear cattle with a load. So we can imagine that people were moving their equipment, their horses and their lumber on the ice in the winter when they could. This could be a tricky job. So children had jobs, sometimes, little small jobs or bigger jobs, but there were many schools in the township. So we were very fortunate in the township that almost every concession, which is like 1,000 acres of land, that one of those big blocks that I showed you on the map, almost every concession had a schoolhouse. And the schoolhouse that Forrest and Benson and Harry went to, and in fact, the next generation went to as well, is SS number 10. And that school is still on 8th Line Road as a private home now. And that would have been was a classic one-room school, multiple grades with one teacher probably. And students often missed classes in the fall for harvesting, or in the diary, sometimes it was just too snowy to go to school because the children walked to school. So on the map, you can see that it's a couple of kilometers maybe to school. So if the snow is deep, they just couldn't get to school. When the children reached a certain age, they could go pass some exams and go to a continuation school, which was like a high school. And there was one later on in the village of Metcalfe. This is a beautiful brick building, which sadly we don't have anymore, SS number 11. And Forrest was writing his exams in the diary. He writes that he's going to go and do the exams to try to get into the next level of education. In the diary also, we see that children could be very well read at an earlier age maybe than nowadays. Forrest writes in his diary, being very formally, being 11 years old, I wish to account as near as I can remember how many books I have read or heard read. I don't think I can remember them all, but I'll try. So he writes in the diary, if you get a copy, you'll see there's like 90 books he's written a list of. And these are some of the books that I think maybe some of us as adults may not yet have read. Les Miserables, he actually writes how many pages long it was. It was 1,448 pages, but he finished it, one assumes. So he was reading, Sherlock Holmes and Shakespeare, Dickens. He was a well-read lad at 13. A very important part of Millie's life was her faith. And in the diary, around the top of the pages of that, those big pages, Millie rings the pages with prayers and inspirational quotes, sometimes the lines of hymns. And thank you to my sister-in-law for helping me match some of those quotations to sections, to scripture. In Millie's case, her family church was the Holy Trinity Anglican Church. And that building still exists now, and it's one of the most beautiful buildings in our village. It's one of the only stone building in our village, and it's been very, very nicely maintained. So there were lots of things happening at church. The family always goes to church unless the weather is very, very bad. And then if they don't go to church, they have Sunday school in their house, which I think means that Millie must sit her little boys down and, make sure that they get the lesson of the week. There were vestry meetings, deanery meetings, guild meetings, they're often mentioned, and the minister often came to their home. It's mentioned in the diary as well. And there were also Orange Lodge activities are mentioned as well. And in the village, there were several churches of different denominations, a Roman Catholic church, a Methodist church, I believe. There were more than this church, for sure. But lest you think it was all work and no play, there was still time for social visits. And this is a great photo of ladies from Metcalfe, who we can probably guess that Millie probably knew these women. And in fact, the little boy on the far left is a boy who's mentioned in the diary as a friend of the boys. And I think the woman beside him is his mother, according to the photograph in the museum. So these are women of the time. We can see what clothing they're wearing. It's always really interesting to me to see the fashions of the day. And Millie mentions, in fact, in one of her entries that she'd got she'd received her whites, which are these white shirts that were very popular at the time. And that I've just put a picture there from Eaton's mail order catalog of these very blousy dresses with the tiny little waists that were very popular. So Millie had an eye for fashion as well. So just how big was Millie's world? Here we can see some of the villages or the locations around the Latimer farm, which you can see is in what they call North Osgood. These are the places that are mentioned in the diary. So we see Greeley was where the cemetery was that the family used. So there was not a cemetery for that particular church at that time in our village. And Millie mentions going to the cemetery. Snake Island Road is one of the places that Fred and his boys go to cut lumber, although they don't call it Snake Island Road, but we know that was a place that lumbering happened late on in the 1900s. We see Edwards was an important train stop, more on that later. And Millie had relatives there that she could stay overnight if the weather was bad, or if she needed to, presumably, to go and have a tea before she went on the train. Panna Road, there was also, at the end of Panna Road, there was a train stop as well. Metcalfe, Russell, we can see they went for supplies there, and there were sometimes Orange Lodge meetings there, as well as in Metcalfe. Kenmore, we know it had a mill, a big mill, and there were hockey games there, mentioned in the diary. And Metcalfe figures, of course, the most. There was a church there, the school, relatives, shopping. It really was the center of their world, as it is for many of us still. So here is another fantastic map, which was made in the early 1900s. The fire insurance companies, as a business, would map a village and actually show on the map by the different colors of buildings what the building is made of. So this is amazing for research. So you can see what buildings are there and what what was in town, because it tells you the purpose of the building as well. So in this picture, we can see also a lot of gray, and those gray buildings are all what they call the drive sheds, which at first I didn't know what that was, but that's basically your parking lot, where you put your horses and your carriages. So almost every building has one. And in the center of the village, I'm going to show you a close-up in a minute. We can see there were several hotels. Metcalfe was a hopping place. And they, of course, need a lot of space to have their, put their horses. You can see here the creek as well. The creek still runs through the village of Metcalfe. So what was in Metcalfe in 1908? Here is a list. I don't need to read it all to you, but you can see that it was even better than today. 2 bakeries, people, 500 people. So the population of Metcalfe now is about 2,000. So it was a quarter the size, but there was, you can see, a lot more businesses because of transportation. People wanted to, people were not going to go very far afield to get their carriage repaired or to buy their groceries or whatever. So here we can see the different colors more closely, and you can see that the yellow is for wood. The pink shows that a building is made of brick. So in this close-up, which unfortunately I cannot see it as well as you guys, because we see that Albert Street, 8th Line Road, depending when you came to know our village, 8th Line Road used to be called Albert Street. So it's Victoria and Albert, the king and queen of England in the 1800s. So we can see at the corner there was a commercial hotel. This is the same corner now where we have our little park. So there were several hotels in Metcalfe, and we can imagine that that was probably a very nice place to go and have a meal, maybe have a drink. It's quite a popular little spot. And Millie and her family were always going down to Metcalfe. There were a lot of ways to get around with all this socializing and working. Here we can see different forms of transportation that are mentioned in the diary. And these pictures I pulled from the internet, from a factory in Brockville that made these different types of transportation. This car, the sleigh, the buggy. These are all different pieces of transportation that were used, and that a family that wasn't particularly wealthy would have had, because you needed a different vehicle depending on the weather to get around. And also we see the little sketches that come from the diary, and I like to imagine that that's Millie walking there with her umbrella and possibly hauling along little Benson behind, because he was the littlest of the family, and she's very, very fond of him. We can tell that in her writing of the diary. The man with the bicycle is Charlie, and thanks to the family for sharing this photo, Charlie Cummings, and he appears a lot in the diary. He seems to be, I can't research exactly, I haven't found exactly, but he's obviously a hired hand, but maybe more so than that, because he lives there often, and he's mentioned with fondness by Millie when she's writing, her little report for the day. So obviously Charlie had a wheel. It was called his wheel. That is his bicycle, which would have been a good way to get around, except when it was muddy or snowy or rainy. So it was probably more of a fair weather vehicle. And then one of my favorite things in the diary was Shelby the horse. And I like to imagine this family, the Latimer family, for example, and many families, had many horses, like 4 or 5 horses, because they would need some for work horses and they would need some for pulling, buggies and things. And in the diary, the boys actually list in several times how, the names of their horses. Anyway, Shelby appears several times, and Shelby the horse did not like motor cars. We hear this because in several entries, poor Shelby runs away, and it's, a little sad entry. The boys were walking home. Let's see, when in Metcalfe, on their way coming home, they met a motor car, says Millie. Shelby, very much frightened, ran through Mr. James Dowser's yard, broke the crossbar of the express. Boys walking home, Fred was hurt a little. So it actually was a dangerous thing when motor cars and horses first began to mix, when there were not the same rules that there would be now. We can imagine that it would have been very frightening for a horse to meet a motor car. And this picture on the left is actually Shelby the horse, and we can't see exactly, but we like to think that it was maybe Millie is in the back there with her sister-in-law going to town. You can see there's a little flag on the side of there. There must have been a happy event they were going to. And on the right-hand side, we see an old building, which still is in Metcalfe. And on the northeast side, it's now a business and an apartment building. And in front of that building, you can see an old motor, well, looks like a car, but it actually was a motor, like a bus. And Millie mentions this in her diary, that she goes on the motor, she calls it, into Ottawa. And this was very exciting. She said, out to Metcalfe, let's see. Miss Baker and I went to Ottawa this morning on the 7:30 motor. We're in the city a little after 9. So we can see it took them an hour and a half to get into Ottawa. I came out the same evening. I enjoyed my ride very much, which was my first on the motor. Fred, not well today. So maybe Fred couldn't take her to the city, and so she decided to go on the motor instead. Now, very exciting news. There was a train that went right through our community, not through Metcalfe, but to the east of it in those days. So often Millie writes that she's taking the train into Ottawa, or Fred is taking the train into Ottawa. And as I showed you earlier on the map, you could walk to the end of Panna Road, and there was a flag station where presumably you stand and just wave your hand and the train stops. And also in Edwards. And on the left, you can see the map that shows the stops. This was a train route that went from Ottawa all the way down into New York State, and would have been so handy. Part of this route now makes up the recreational trail that runs from Russell to Embrun. So if you live in that area, you know about the bike path. That is actually the old railway route that Millie would have gone on. And Benson writes, when he's a young teenager, he goes with his Auntie Millie into Ottawa on the train. And he's to visit Forrest, who's then has moved out of and is living in the city. And he is very excited that he's riding on the train into Ottawa. And like I say, it was just so handy. They could even walk. Sometimes she'll say, Fred walked home from Panna Road, which would be maybe, let's say a couple of miles, not too onerous for a farming family. There were a lot of other interesting things in the diary. Obviously, I can't list them all, but something that caught my eye was there was a reference to one little boy, or at the time I thought it was a man, Fred Kirkup, whose name you can see, if you can read the little writing there in the census, came to help one day with the maple syrup. So I wondered, well, who's this guy, Fred? And I noticed in the census that it showed that he was young and that he had arrived in England in 1905. And actually, when I did a little more research, I found out that he was a British home child. And you may know what that means. in the late 1800s and in the early 1900s, a lot of orphaned or poor children who weren't orphaned but whose families could not care for them, a lot of children were sent on ships to Canada and were basically farmed out or adopted by families in communities such as the Metcalfe area. So this little boy, I found, arrived on this particular boat in 1905, and he went first to a large receiving home, almost like a boarding school in Peterborough. And somehow this little boy ended up going to live with one of Millie's relatives, because in the census I can see that we can see there on the screen, on the slide, you can see it says he's an adopted son. So Milford and his wife have welcomed this boy into their home, possibly because it's free labor, possibly because they wanted to, welcome another child and look after a child who in need. So several of Millie's relatives and other families as well did welcome British home children in our area. And if you are at all interested, there's a really great website where you can read up on the experiences of these children, because they were tracked, they were followed after they were placed in these homes. And it's just an interesting way that children were looked after, poor children were looked after at that time. So there's a lot of other fun things mentioned in the diary, which obviously I can't tell you all of them now, but this little visual shows you some of them. It really, the diary does give a full picture of what life was like in the farm in those days, in the early 1900s. I do want to give a little shout out to the Great Metcalfe Fair, which is mentioned in the diary, because we know it's a very, very important social event, agricultural event in our community to this day. And in 1919, Benson was very happy. He actually writes in the diary that he won $5 prize for his 2 pigs. So we can only imagine how he got his pigs to the Metcalfe Fair. But that I thought was just a lovely thing, as we've just had our Metcalfe Fair just a few weeks ago. So we can be really thankful that Millie and her family had the energy after a long, hard days to write the diary, because it gives us a really nice, very local picture of what life is like in our community. And even though it's not incredibly personal, we don't, it's obviously Millie wrote in it knowing her nephews would write in it. So there's not super personal things in there, but we can still feel the love that she has for her family and those little boys. And so you can just really get a picture of a big family that's typical of that era. If you have a diary of your own in your family, you might find some of if it's a Canadian diary, local, you might find some of these links useful. So I believe the museum staff, Jillian and Caitlin, will put these links onto the website for you. So there's the Country Atlas digital project that I mentioned before, where the whole book has been photocopied, and you can look up any county in Ontario that existed in 1879 and see who was living where at the time. Similarly, the Ontario Fire Insurance plans, you can look up different villages or cities and see what the village looked like in those days, which is really interesting. The Rural Diary Archive, if you like diaries and you're now curious about other diaries written in the past, that is an archive of Ontario rural diaries, and you can search by location. So you could say, I would like to see are there any diaries in Kemptville, and it will sort them that way. some of the text is already there in a PDF. You can just download it and read it right away. And some of them you have to maybe buy a copy or request a copy. Ancestry.ca, well, I just use that site a lot. That's the only one that you have to actually pay for to use. The British Home Child Registry I told you about already. The One Room Schoolhouse has a great resource of little rural schools, and there's a photograph for each one. So you can search again by county or township, and that's fun to see. And then our own museum has a very interesting website and a lot of publications that you might be interested to look at or to purchase depending where you live. So that's pretty much the end of my talk. As I mentioned, I actually lived in this house that the diary was written in. And it occurred to me that, in fact, perhaps this is not the end of the project, because I myself wrote a few sad, teary diaries in my early days. And, perhaps they will be ready for release in 2066, which would be 100 years later. Or perhaps I will have to just rush home and burn them all now. I would just like to say so much thank you to Ruth and Helen Latimer, the sisters who shared this diary with us and me and kept me sane during the pandemic. And I hope you were able to get a sense of what life was like at the time of the diary. And maybe you're going to be interested to learn a little more about our community. And if you were tempted, you can, in fact, order a copy of the diary. The museum has gone to a lot of trouble to get it ready. And you can order it, you can pre-order it online. I'm giving a shameless plug because it really is quite interesting to see. And as I mentioned, it's not just the text. In the diary, you will be able to see who wrote each entry. So it won't be as challenging to read as for me the first time. And also at the back, there is the master index of all the people who are mentioned and any little details that might help you if you're doing research. And also there's a list of events and places, just out of curiosity. So for people who are doing research, they can just flip through and go, oh yeah, I'm doing a project on agricultural fairs, and I see here are the 3 references that might be interesting. So, and now I'm just going to pass it back to the museum staff. And if anyone has any questions, and of course, any errors in the diary regarding genealogy would be my errors, because I don't know the Latimer family inside out, or my community inside out. So if I've put the wrong concession or something, just you'll just have to make a good guess. But so does anyone have any questions?
So we just want to be cognizant of everyone's time, but if you do have any questions, feel free to unmute yourself or add it in the chat. If you add it in the chat, I can read it off for you. If anyone has any questions for Sarah. Thank you so much, Sarah. That was wonderful.
Okay. Might have gone over time.
No, we're perfect.
Mm-hmm.
No worries.
Yeah,
Does anyone have any questions?
It's such a wonderful document to be able to shed some light into our local rural history and, what society and what economics and everyday life was like. So thank you, Sarah, and to the Latimer family for being able to share that with us.
Pleasure. Yeah.
I think
Sarah,
Helen has a question.
Hi, Sarah. It's Joanne Daly. Hi.
Oh, hello.
Thank you so much. Your talk was excellent, and I've been looking forward to it for several weeks now. I just wanted to say that I had heard that Osgood Township was a dry township. And did you ever read that?
Oh, I don't know that. Yes, it was a dry township in the time of Prohibition, I would assume. And I sadly don't know all the details, but yes, it was. And I believe only maybe in the 60s, it was a big deal that that there would be, drink available. You're right. So perhaps I referred to people drinking, and I could have been wrong on that front. Nowhere is it mentioned. Yes.
And the only other thing I was going to say was I had also heard that Metcalfe was a stop for the, oh gosh, I'm having a senior's moment. the stagecoach. I heard that Metcalfe was a stagecoach stop. Did you hear that too?
Yeah, I have heard that, and I believe that would be why we had so many hotels in the 1900. The map, the earlier map, or it's 1889. The fire insurance map shows 3 hotels, and yes, I think that stagecoaches used to come through here. But then Osgood, when they were picking routes for the train, Osgood Village got the train, not Metcalfe. So even though we had that train on the east, it really still didn't go to our town. So that is supposed to be sort of the start of the demise of the hotel industry in Metcalfe in 1908. Yeah.
And do you know when the last hotel at the corner was torn down?
I don't, but maybe Jillian does. I believe it was there in the early 60s still. Relatively recently, but you know, I don't know that. The museum might be able to answer that.
Yeah, that's a great question. We probably have to refer back to our publications that we have for a date where the park currently is now. Is what you're asking? Where the Victoria Hotel would have been? Yeah. We'll have to take a look and see.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions? Feel free.
Nobody wants to know about Charlie the rink. It was a very exciting moment for Benson. He wrote about it quite a lot in his diary. The whole plot of the movie, he was clearly really quite taken with that movie, which was in, I think, 1916 or something.
So there is a question here. Is it still possible to trace the old route and stations of the train?
The train, well, yes. I mean, they're marked on the map there. And in fact, if you look on Google, on Geo Ottawa, which is a website funded by the city of Ottawa, if you look between Edwards and Metcalfe, Edwards and Russell rather, you can see in the fields kind of the route that the train would have gone on. So yeah, I think it's still possible. And I believe at the end of the Metcalfe, the Russell to Embrun bike path, there is a little train station, which I believe dates from that time as well, because the train stopped in Embrun as well as Russell.
Awesome. We've got a comment here from Wayne Latimer. Benson was my grandfather, which is awesome.
Yeah.
Lots of very nice comments.
Oh, I can't see them, but I'm just happy that people enjoyed it.
We'll read them to you after. It's quite a few.
Great.
Okay, so if there aren't any more questions, I just want to say again, thank you so much, Sarah, for all your hard work. And just before we go, this talk will be available on YouTube. So if you would like to share it at some point with someone, it will be on the museum's YouTube page. So, all right. Well, thank you so much again. And I hope everyone has a great weekend and a great night.
Okay. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Sarah and the Latimer family.
Yeah. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.